born and raised in Chicago, grew up in Inglewood.
Okay.
Inglewood's mother was a single mom, 10th grade education, and so she worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3. And being the youngest of home alone a lot, we used the block club and the neighbors on the block to help raise me. Well, again, Inglewood, there was it may still be there, I doubt it, an Amtrak hub right there, and near, not too far from my home. And so there was a train called the Hummingbird. I remember that just because I didn't know what I'm a Chicago girl. I didn't know what a hummingbird was.
Right.
And my mother, as I said, had multiple jobs. So during the summer when she had her 3rd job, and she was, gone most of the day, she would send me south to be with my relatives. And I was about 12, I think, the first time she did that, 11 or 12. And there was a great group, I think they still meet around, Travelers and Immigrants Aid, which worked with young people and seniors traveling alone. And so I'd get on the train, they'd put me on the train, in the front of the train, and my mother had me packed with all kind of goodies and chocolate chip, you name it, I had it. Because it was a long trip. And what the woman would say is, I will check on you, or someone will check on you, during the pass. And they did. They would come to see, are you doing okay, So that was great. But often, well, not often, but in the middle of the night, I would have to get up and move to the back of the train. And I didn't know why. I mean, they would wake me. So, they were still very good about it. No, nothing said, oh, hate to wake you, but you got. And when I'd get back there were all African Americans, and they'd say, oh, come back. And they'd have pies and all kind of stuff. And some people were asleep, some people weren't. Some people were playing cards. I mean, and it was cool. I really, So the next summer, when I would got on the train, I asked her, well, why can't I just start in the back of the train? And she said, no, it doesn't work like that. Well, I later understood, as I got older, that once you passed the Mason-Dixon line, African Americans could not be in the front of the train. I mean,
Yeah.
It is complex. I mean, it is no one thing versus the other. It is no one group versus the other. And I think if we look at it from the complexity that it is, and it is complex, which is why many people shy away from it, or at least attempt to, there is no one-size-fits-all as we deal with the complex nature of it. What happens, racism as it relates to, and I do make this distinction, descendants of slaves versus African immigrants, and there are distinctions there, versus indigenous people, Native Americans versus, Latinos and immigrants. It's all complex, and there is no one size, as I said, fits all. And then to deal with it structurally, we have to recognize how different it is, that it is not one thing. And as we encourage young people, and quite frankly, old people, I don't give up on us as well, we need to look at how we deal with this complexity. It's uncomfortable. It is not what people necessarily want to do. But if we're going to struggle with it, and it is a struggle, then we have to recognize how complex it is. My easy way of saying it is you can't fix it if you don't face it.
Yeah.
And we have to face how structural it is, how somehow hidden it is until we've experienced it. Well, I think that is a crucial piece. One person, the only one person that I believe in that could do that is our Lord. And so the question then for many of us is, I'm not Christ. Why am I? What can I? I think you can do what you can do where you can do it. I'm not going to be a pastor, but I did as I could as a lawyer and as other professions. I did what I could where I could, and I think that's and what they used to say when I was growing up, each one teach one. And if you teach one other person or enable one other person, that may be all you can do. I mean, and that's what my pastor did. He did it more than I think he even had any idea he was doing it. But it was a one at a time. It was some group stuff, but sometimes it was just a one at a time sit down and say, let's talk about it. And sometimes that's all you can do, and that's all you need to do. I think this question on this issue of who can fix it, I think that's God. I think we are enabled to be God's helper in that. I think everything and nothing.
Okay.
It is a complex time. Again, we've had, from a political standpoint in this country, we've had some wonderful successes. And I want to, again, one of my relatives in the South he's passed along now, and I think two things he said to me, and being a know-it-all person that he knew I was, I poo-pooed him, and he was right as always. In the early 70s, and this was before I even got out of law school, he said, again, he got his degree from Tuskegee, and he said his biggest fear was that the norms of the South would become the norms of this country. And then he lived, I think he died a year after President Obama was inaugurated, and he said, we have every right to celebrate this short-term political reform, but not at the expense of long-term structural change. And once again, I said, there you go again, but he's right. I mean, and it's not about politics. In his mind, structural change is not about who you vote for. That's not the issue. The issue is who we care about, how we treat each other as human beings, the issue of seeing each other in an equal setting, and not being fearful of calling racism. The structural issues of racism are still here with us. We've made some great progress, but we have a long way to go. What was hidden before is now transparent. And so with that transparency comes the feeling of I can do it because either nobody's going to care, and even if they care, I'm not going to get in trouble. Because it's societal. And particularly for young people, where misinformation, disinformation is, as you say, transferred on social media, So it's a scary time in some ways, that some of the things that people like myself took for granted as in terms of, civil rights and race are in jeopardy. And it in some ways, I think Dr. King would be, on the one hand, elated, particularly with Chicago area when he came. I mean, the adopted home of the first African-American president. On the other hand, I think he would be on his knees in tears. The Inglewood that he was at and spoke in technically doesn't exist anymore. It's been abandoned. On the one hand, great progress, great success. On the other, great need and great frustration that we've come so far and yet have so far to come. I think part of it is we have to recognize it. I think that, in the 60s, people were pushing and moving and,
They were having the conversation.
They were having the conversations, and they were challenging each other. They were not just talking about it and because for me, the issue, and my pastor used to always say, there was a great conversation, what's next? It depends upon what specifically we're talking about. Housing issues are different from economic issues in terms of jobs, although they are interconnected, but access to them is different. Education is a whole nother, we hear things made up like, our tax dollars in Lake County are paying for, schools in Chicago. It's just not true. And so those structural things that are there that permit and continue the inequities are the issues. And we need to know what we don't know. And we need to not, right now I could find something, and I'm good at making up stuff. I could make up something and find something online right now that would say that was correct.
Okay.
We have to stop doing that. We have to live and understand what the real facts are. Not what the facts that I want them to be.
Right.
Because I could find those. But we have to know now, and that's the challenge I think that wasn't there for me in the 60s and 70s, because the facts were the facts, whether I liked them or not. What now, there are 2, maybe 3 sets of what are called facts out there. And what we have to do now is discern the real truth behind them and deal with it, because it may not be what I want to hear. So then how do I find out the truth? And we have to have the patience for that. Yep. What I find now with technology is the lack of patience. Yep. I want my answer in 5 seconds, and that's it, and I'm on to the next one. Those 5-second answers may be the ones you need to worry about, particularly on complex issues. Non-complex issues, go for it. But complex societal issues, take the time and realize it will take time. There's so many complex things that our society is composed of. that it takes the church, I think, and that's why I applaud the leadership here at Joy, to really tackle this in a deep way with the young and the old, because it is not a simple issue,
No.
and it's an ongoing issue. It is not going to end anytime soon, and it's not a political issue. It is a structural issue in my mind that defies politics. In my mind, it is a spiritual issue, because if we are to abide by love our neighbors as ourselves, then these issues are part of that. To enable us to love our neighbors as ourselves, these are the issues we've got to tackle and structurally try to understand, or we will never be able to abide by that. And quite honestly, it was an informal setting. It wasn't like the Speaking at Soldiers Field that got all the hoopla. It was basically because the ministers that I was talking about invited him, and it was a beautiful park. It's called Ogden Park. I guess it's still there. And he spoke on a platform. In fact, there's pictures of it in a book called The Chicago Freedom Movement. And he basically he wasn't even talking about civil rights, as I remember, because we were barbecuing and doing a bunch of stuff. He was talking about, kids, mind your family, mind your parents, stay in school, do good work, we're all together on this, look out for each other. I mean, he was more talking about to us as individual young people rather than about civil rights. And probably because civil rights would have went over, at that time went over it. But he also said things like, community is important. Understand your community and where you fit. I remember that word. He said something like, understand where you fit. Understand who you are in your community and what that means. And so my pastor who took us, that was the reason we were there. That was part of the I think it was during the summer that he spoke, because I think that was part of our vacation Bible school or some kind of project he turned that into. The quote Dr. King made, understand who you are in your community and what that means. And so we did different projects from that. But for me then, it didn't mean civil rights. It meant do what I'm doing in my community. And that's how he was as a person. He didn't always, and when you talk to how he was able to, and understand that, and I know this from others, he and people like Malcolm X did not fight as much as people think. Now they didn't agree on everything either, but what somebody said about them, what they did agree on, and they agreed to agree upon, was the end goal. Okay. How you got there was where they had the biggest disagreement, but they agreed on the end goal being the equality of African American people in this, but he was also, because he didn't pick the fight with, well, you shouldn't do it that way, he was able to embrace people and, quite frankly, swing people away from those who didn't agree with his nonviolent position. He could swing people over to him by saying, I understand your frustration. I'm not going to endorse it. It's not what I would do. It's not what I believe needs to be done. But believe me, I understand it. And that would, in some ways, make them more angry because they couldn't say, see, he's only, because he wouldn't do that. So that's how he could walk the path of in places that many people couldn't. I Have a Dream speech. You had people who didn't support Dr. King quoting portions of I Have a Dream speech. I know that in Chicago because there were people there quoting it who I knew. I said, wait, I didn't know you like Dr. King. But that speech was embracing of the dream of all of us. And so I think he was blessed in a way, as Martin Luther, to be able to carry that load and deliver in a way that, and there were others who, media didn't know, because one, they weren't as eloquent as speakers as he was. But I think that eloquence was a God's gift when you look at, and there was, and I used to give tests at the Leadership Council of the Big Six in the Civil Rights Movement, so I'm going to throw that out there to see if anybody will be able to answer who the Big Six in the Civil Rights Movement was. But of the Big Six, he was the most renowned in many ways because of his eloquence. And I think that was God's gift to him and to us. He supposedly he did memorized the I Have a Dream speech and, with Coretta and others, and changed a lot of it when he gave it out. A lot of what he gave out in D.C. was not But again, that's what you want from someone. You want them to be able to articulate, but you also want them to be able to feel the moment, let the moment, and so a lot of the I Have a Dream was momentary. It came out of the experience, and so I think that when you have someone like that, it can cross the aisles. It can cross, it was said, and John Lewis and others talked about when they were arrested in the Birmingham jails, he would talk to his jailers. He would say, can we talk? That's what made him so unique, and so inspirational, and so that's why we're talking about him some 45 or how many years later from his departure, because what he left with us is still here. Because I think that what we're talking about is the path of righteousness for us all. And, there are some, Martin Luther King and others who paved that way, and for us to follow in that path is the issue. Part of who his aura was. He was the challenge of, being, disrespected, being, ignored, being hurt, didn't hold him back. And, even in Chicago, he had death threats, and, and his comment, that he had not experienced the same kind of racial behavior, discrimination behavior in Mississippi that he, anywhere that he experienced in Marquette Park.
Wow.
And that left, talk about leaving Chicago with a blow. But yeah, I mean, and again, it's the kind of thing you unless you're blessed to be around it, it's hard to describe, because you feel it more than you see it. Mm-hmm. You can see it and go, okay, but when you feel it, that's when you go, oh my God, I'm feeling this. Yeah. And and for me and others like me, I don't pretend to be alone in this. That's what got me, that feeling of as someone called it, spiritual justice, holy, God's holy justice is what it inspired you to look for and work toward. And it's complicated. As I said, it is not a one and done. It's many layers of it, and it's lessons learned when you fail. I mean, some things, engaged in, that didn't work. I mean, what do you learn from that? And what do you try to do differently? Who do you try to engage? I think that much of the civil rights movement is not acknowledged as an interracial piece of it. There were Jewish people. Two of the people that we know of that died, in the civil rights movement were white, men and a woman, who were standing up with African Americans. So it's not like it's been only, African Americans who have been willing to give their lives for this. And the history of those people needs to be as honored and as reflected in all of what we do, because we're all in this together.
Yeah. Like
it or not, this is not a one thing. We're all in it together.
No, we're part of a community. As much as people want to isolate and do their own thing.
That's exactly, well, that's what he talked about when I was a teenager. You're a part of a community. Know who you are, so you pull me full circle. Know who you are in your community, and because that's what it is. And he didn't. Tina thought he meant my block club, but he meant community as a whole.
Yeah.
And as you got older, you saw that. But that's what I think is part of the challenge, and it's hard because some people don't want to hear it.
No.
Some people want to go home and be done with this and everything. But that's them. I think those of us who feel called, those of us acknowledge the calling, do what we have to do.
Yeah, and I think if you're a Christ follower, we're kind of all called. What was Jesus' main bent in life? Look for the groups of people that were being pushed down, and watch out, because anytime there's a group of people that is being pushed down so another group can be higher, Jesus' pattern was to break that up and to call it for what it was. Call a spade a spade.
That's right.
Yeah.
But Jesus was also the same Jesus that threw the money changers out of the temple.
Yes.
Who when it was called for, was willing to step up and say, this is wrong, and this is what I'm going to do about it. And did that as a young, So, I mean, this is, there are parts where you have to be willing to stand up and say, this is wrong, and this is what I'm going to do about it. If we're going to be Christ-like, all of it isn't, Christ was not only the benevolent and the forgiving one, but he also was the one that stood up and said, this is wrong. We have to be willing, in a Christ-like manner, to step up and line here, you crossed it, that's bad.
Yeah.
And that's dialogue. That does not mean that, the people hopefully are abandoned forever, but you have to step up and say, but that was wrong.
Yeah.
And that's what I love about Joy in talking about it in conversation and saying, if you're comfortable around people having conversation that is wrong, and you don't say, you're right to say it, but it's wrong, and then I think that is what our Christ has taught us.